When Colonel Hayes looked at the black nurse assigned to treat him and said, "Get someone else," he had no idea who he was talking to. Amara Cole didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She simply stepped aside. But as she turned away, her sleeve shifted, and Hayes saw something on her arm that made his stomach drop. A tattoo that should have been impossible. One that tied them both to a classified mission, 3 dead Marines, and a secret someone had spent 6 years burying. He dismissed her in seconds. That was his first mistake. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The call came through at 4:47 in the morning. Not the slow, routine kind of call that trickles into a military hospital on a quiet night. This one crackled over the radio with urgency baked into every word. A convoy was inbound. Casualties confirmed. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. 12 minutes. The trauma wing of Fort Caldwell Military Medical Center was already buzzing before the first vehicle even pulled through the gate. Nurses snapped on gloves. Doctors barked orders at residents who were still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Gurneys rattled down tile corridors, their wheels squeaking in rhythm with the controlled chaos of people who knew exactly what to do and had very little time to do it. Amara Cole heard the radio call from a nurse's station at the end of the hall. She was already on her feet before the dispatcher finished the sentence. She wasn't the type to wait for someone else to move first. She was 32 years old and had worked trauma nursing for going on 9 years, 4 of them in military medical settings. She wasn't loud about it. She wasn't the nurse who wore her experience on her face or her voice. She wore it in the way she moved, calm and deliberate, like someone who'd seen enough chaos to stop being surprised by it. Her colleagues noticed. The veterans in the unit, in particular, seemed to register it without knowing quite what to name. She gathered her supplies with quiet efficiency, checked the trauma bay assignment board, and moved toward the entrance bay where the convoy vehicles were already pulling in, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn dark, engines low and grinding like they'd been pushed too hard for too long. The first few Marines who stumbled or were helped out were in rough shape, but coherent. Shrapnel wounds, 1 fractured arm, a head laceration that was bleeding impressively but wasn't as serious as it looked. Standard, awful, manageable. Then they brought out Colonel Daniel Hayes. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and built the way men who've spent 20-plus years in the field are built, like the body has been stripped of everything soft and forged into something purely functional. His left arm was wrapped in field dressing that had soaked through twice over, and his face was tight with the kind of pain that a man like him would never in 100 years admit to. He was moving under his own power, refusing the support of the corpsman beside him, and that told Amara everything she needed to know about the kind of man she was dealing with. He walked through the trauma bay doors and took one look around the room the way a man assesses a battlefield. Fast, sweeping, taking inventory. Dr. Philip Garrett, the senior trauma physician on duty, moved toward him immediately, speaking in that practiced, confident tone designed to reassure and redirect. Colonel Hayes, I'm Dr. Garrett. We're going to get that arm stabilized. The imaging team is ready, and we'll have you. Who's on triage? Hayes cut in. His voice was controlled, but had an edge to it that didn't invite conversation. Nurse Cole is your primary tonight, Garrett said without hesitation. Hayes' eyes moved to Amara. She was already 2 steps toward him, tray of supplies in hand, expression steady and professional. Their eyes met for exactly half a second. His jaw tightened. Get someone else, he said. I don't need a rookie nurse. The room didn't stop, exactly. People kept moving, kept working, but there was a shift. A subtle tilting of attention, like everyone had heard it, but was pretending they hadn't. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't recoil or look to Dr. Garrett for help. She simply held her position, expression unchanged, and let the silence sit for a beat before she spoke. I'm not a rookie, sir, she said. Just that. Clear, unbothered, factual. I don't care what you are. Give me someone else. Dr. Garrett stepped in smoothly, attempting to manage the moment. Colonel, Nurse Cole is one of our most experienced trauma nurses. I didn't ask for her credentials. Hayes hadn't looked away from the far wall. I asked for someone else. The Marines who had come in with him, 3 of them standing or sitting nearby while their own wounds were assessed, exchanged glances. Corporal Eli Turner, the youngest of the group, a 23-year-old with a bandaged shoulder and wide, observant eyes, watched the exchange with open discomfort. He'd served under Hayes for 14 months. He'd seen Hayes make calls that cut straight through complexity and land on what was right. This didn't look like one of those moments, and Eli didn't know what to do with that. Amara set her tray down on the cart beside her. Calmly. No drama in it. No performance of offense or hurt. She simply stepped to the side, took up a position near the secondary station, and went about reorganizing supplies with the same focused quiet she'd carried into the room. The absence of argument seemed to land harder on Hayes than an argument would have. Dr. Garrett flagged down Nurse Rebecca Aldrich, who crossed the bay to take the lead on Hayes' assessment. He was capable and professional, and the situation was handled. But the room had a different texture now. Hayes sat on the examination table and let Aldrich begin cutting away the field dressing on his arm. The wound beneath, it was serious, a deep laceration from shrapnel, muscle involvement, potential nerve compromise, but survivable with proper care. Aldrich worked without comment. Hayes stared at the opposite wall, and then, without fully meaning to, his gaze drifted. Amara was leaning across a card at the secondary station, reaching for something on the lower shelf. The motion pulled her sleeve up past her wrist, just a few inches just for a moment, and Hayes saw it. A tattoo. Part of one, anyway. Dark ink, geometric lines, something that suggested a symbol rather than decorative art. She straightened up, and her sleeve fell back into place as naturally as if nothing had happened. But Hayes had gone still. Not in an obvious way. His face didn't change, and he didn't say anything. But something behind his eyes shifted, a private reckoning happening somewhere beneath the surface. His jaw worked once, and he looked away. Aldrich noticed the change in his body language. "You doing all right, Colonel? We can administer something for the pain." "I'm fine," Hayes said. Automatic. Flat. He was not looking at his own wound. He was thinking about something else entirely. Eli Turner, from his position across the bay where a nurse was cleaning the shrapnel graze on his shoulder, watched Hayes with a slight furrow in his brow. In 14 months, he'd never seen the colonel look unsettled. Uncertain even. That was the only word for what he was seeing right now. Uncertainty. And on Hayes, it looked as out of place as mud on a dress uniform. Amara, for her part, went on working. She was asked by Dr. Garrett to take over a second patient, a sergeant with a leg wound who'd come in on the same convoy, and she moved to that task without skipping a beat. Eli watched her work on the sergeant, and what he saw was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had the sergeant calm within 2 minutes, the wound assessed and packed within 5, and the man's blood pressure stabilized before the supervising physician had even crossed the bay to check in. The sergeant, a big, gruff man named Daniels who'd grumbled about waiting, actually thanked her when she was done, said it quietly, like he was surprised the word came out. Eli filed that away. Toward the end of that first hour, when the initial surge of treatment had settled into a steadier rhythm and Hayes was waiting on imaging results, something shifted in the room again. Amara was charting near the nurse's station when Hayes spoke. Not loudly, not toward anyone in particular, but clearly enough that it reached her. "Who covered the last trauma intake before this one?" Dr. Garrett answered without looking up from his tablet. "Cole did. 70-minute window. For critical patients, all stabilized." Hayes said nothing, but his eyes moved to Amara, and this time he held the look a half-second longer before dropping it. She did not look back. Later, when the bay had quieted and the Marines had been moved to recovery rooms or observation, one of the more experienced nurses on the floor, a woman named Diane, who'd been working military hospitals for 16 years and had very little patience for anything that wasted her time, leaned against the wall near Amara while they both waited for lab results. "Don't let it get under your skin," Diane said, not unkindly. "It didn't," Amara said, which was true. "Word is he transferred from Kelly Barracks about 6 months before you did," Diane added, almost as an afterthought. "And apparently when you put in for the transfer here, there was some back and forth with administration. Someone on his side had questions." Amara kept her eyes on the monitor. "Is that right?" "I'm just saying," Diane said. "There's usually a story behind something like that." Amara didn't answer, but the line between her brows deepened slightly. She went back to her station, picked up the clipboard for Hayes' case to update the handoff notes for the morning team, and paused for just a moment. She wrote slowly, precisely. When she was done, she set the clipboard back down and turned toward the hall. Hayes was being wheeled back from imaging when their paths crossed. His eyes found her immediately, like he'd been tracking the door, and she stopped because the orderly needed to pass. For a moment, in the narrow corridor, they were 3 feet apart. His arm was immobilized, his face was tired, and whatever guard he'd been holding up since he came through those doors had thinned just enough to show something underneath it. Amara looked at him steadily. Then she said, quietly and without any particular inflection, "Sir, you might want to look again before deciding who you trust." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped aside to let the orderly pass, turned left at the hall junction, and was gone. Hayes stared at the empty corridor for a long moment. Then he said nothing and let himself be wheeled toward his room. The next morning arrived slow and gray, The kind of November morning at Fort Caldwell that smelled like cold concrete and institutional coffee. The overnight team handed off to the day shift, and Amara Cole came back on duty at 7 a.m., looking exactly the same as she always did. Composed, unhurried, already 3 steps ahead of whatever the morning was about to bring. Colonel Hayes had not slept well. That was evident to anyone who passed his room between 5 and 6 in the morning and heard him moving around or saw the call light blink twice. He hadn't asked for pain management again. He'd asked quietly for the charge nurse. When she arrived, he asked her a single question. How long had Nurse Cole been on staff at Fort Caldwell? The charge nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra who had been doing this job for 22 years and had long since stopped finding military commanders intimidating, told him plainly, 8 months. Transferred from Reynolds Army Community Hospital. Hayes thanked her and didn't ask anything else. But then he asked the orderly who brought his breakfast, and the resident physician who came in to review his imaging. By midday, Hayes had constructed a rough sketch of Amara Cole through other people's answers. None of them knowing quite what he was building, all of them providing only a sliver of a picture. She transferred here after a stint at Reynolds. Before that, something unclear. Her file showed excellent performance reviews across the board. Nobody had much to say about her personal life because she didn't talk about it. She was professionally warm with patients, technically sharp, and otherwise private in a way that some people read as distant and others read as simply focused. That was the whole portrait. It didn't explain what he'd seen on her arm. It didn't explain why the design of that tattoo, partial as the glimpse had been, had made his stomach clench in a way he hadn't felt in years. He lay in a hospital bed with his arm elevated and his mind doing the one thing it had always done best, pulling at threads. There was a mission, classified, 6 years ago, give or take. A reconnaissance unit operating under Hayes' command in a mountainous region that wasn't officially acknowledged. The unit had been compromised. 3 Marines killed, others extracted under extreme conditions. The whole thing had been sealed away under layers of bureaucratic classification, the kind of sealing that was less about protecting national security and more about protecting whoever had made the call that led to the compromise in the first place. Hayes had carried what he believed to be his share of the responsibility ever since. The tattoo the surviving members of that unit wore wasn't standard. It wasn't an official insignia. It was something they designed and inked themselves after the mission, in a backroom parlor off base, a private mark that belonged only to that unit. Only those men. Hayes himself had one on the inside of his right forearm. He'd seen part of something very similar on a nurse's arm at 4:53 in the morning. He told himself it was probably nothing. A coincidence. Similar design elements. He told himself that 6 or 7 times throughout the afternoon, and each time it landed less convincingly. Across the hospital, Amara's day unfolded the way her days usually did, full and demanding, driven by the rhythm of other people's crises. She had 2 critical patients before lunch and a third who came in from a training accident mid-afternoon. Through it all, she moved with the same unhurried precision that Eli Turner, sitting in the observation lounge down the hall with his arm in a sling, was beginning to notice in a more deliberate way. Eli had nothing much to do except wait and watch. His wound didn't require surgery, clean enough, no fragment remaining, but they wanted 48 hours of observation on account of some inflammation near the joint. So he sat, and he thought, and he observed. He watched Amara the way a young person watches someone who makes something hard look easy. He wasn't sure what to name what he was seeing. Competence, maybe, but that was too thin a word for it. It was more like the absence of wasted motion. Like she knew exactly what mattered at any given moment, and was already moving toward it before the moment fully arrived. She came into the observation lounge mid-afternoon to check his chart and his arm. "How's the range of motion?" she asked, sitting across from him and guiding his arm through a gentle arc. "Better than this morning," he said. "Good." She made a note. Then, because she was fundamentally a person who paid attention to people and not just the bodies, "You've been quiet today." Eli looked at her for a second. "I was thinking about this morning," he said, "about what happened in the Bay." She didn't pretend she didn't know what he meant. "And I've served under Colonel Hayes for over a year. He's never," Eli paused, choosing the words carefully. "I've never seen him do anything that looked like that. Whatever that was." Amara set the clipboard on her knee. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of an answer to give. "Military environments have long memories," she said finally. "Sometimes history gets complicated by the fact that not everyone experienced the same version of it." Eli thought about that. "That sounds personal." "Most things are," she said, "even when they're dressed up as something official." She stood, picked up the clipboard, and smiled at him briefly. A real smile, not a professional one. You should try to get some rest. You've got to follow up in the morning. After she left, Eli sat with what she'd said and tried to figure out what he'd actually learned. He came up with very little, but somehow it didn't feel like nothing. Down the hall, Hayes was having a different kind of afternoon. The military brass had called, not in person but by secure line. A two-star general whose name Hayes had known for 15 years delivered the message with practiced pleasantness. They needed Hayes operational again as soon as possible. There were things in motion. Scheduling was a factor. How was the arm? Hayes told him the arm was progressing. He said he understood the urgency. He said all the right things in all the right order. And when the call ended, he set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. Pressure wasn't new, but combined with the specific unease that had been sitting in his chest since the early morning, it had a particular weight today. He asked his afternoon orderly, a cheerful young man named Marcus, to pass a message to the nursing station. He wanted to speak with Nurse Cole if she had a moment between patients. Marcus came back 20 minutes later and told him she'd be available around 4:30. Hayes spent the next 2 hours trying to read the briefing documents that had been cleared for him to review in his room. He retained almost none of it. There was a detail that kept surfacing, a specific memory from the compromised mission 6 years past. One of the men in his unit, a staff sergeant named Raymond Cole, had been among those killed. Raymond Cole had been quiet, methodical, deeply competent, the kind of soldier who made everything around him run better without requiring recognition for it. Hayes had thought about him over the years, the way you think about losses you carry with you without allowing yourself to really sit down with them. Cole. Amara Cole. He told himself it was a common last name. He told himself that at 4:28, and he was still telling himself that when Amara knocked on his room door at 4:31. "You wanted to speak with me?" she said from the doorway. Her posture was relaxed. She wasn't bringing anything in. No chart, no supplies, just her presence and whatever had brought her here. Hayes looked at her from the hospital bed. He was sitting up now, the arm immobilized, but the rest of him present and deliberate. "Close the door," he said. His voice was different from this morning, less like a command and more like a request that had been stripped of unnecessary hardness. She stepped in and closed the door behind her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Where did you serve before, Reynolds?" Amara studied him. She was perfectly still. "Various postings," she said. "I spent time attached to units rather than facilities for a while." "What units?" "Reconnaissance support, medical attachment." She paused. "Classified rosters." He held her gaze. "Where did you serve before this?" he said again, but the phrasing had changed. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a door he was trying to open from the outside, and she was standing on the other side of it. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Same place you did, Colonel." His jaw tightened. "Just not where you were looking." The room was very quiet after that. The hum of the building's ventilation system filled the space. Outside, somewhere down the hall, something clattered and a door closed. Hayes' eyes hadn't moved from hers, and in the stillness that followed, Amara held his gaze without flinching, calm, steady, carrying something he couldn't quite name but was beginning, slowly, to recognize. A weight. The particular, patient weight of someone who has been carrying a truth for a long time and has learned to carry it without letting it bend them. He opened his mouth to say something, closed it again. Whatever he'd thought he might find when he asked her that question, whatever he'd prepared himself to hear, this wasn't quite it. And Hayes, who had spent his entire career moving into uncertainty with controlled authority, found himself in an unfamiliar territory, genuinely not knowing what happened next. He would find out tomorrow. But tonight, in the dim quiet of his recovery room, the thread he'd been pulling it all day had not broken. It had simply pulled taut, and the shape on the other end of it was becoming slowly, terribly clear. The morning after their hallway exchange, something had shifted between them. Not resolved, not repaired, but shifted. The way the air shifts before a storm doesn't break. Something was coming, and both of them knew it. Hayes had lain awake most of the night with a name sitting heavy in his chest. Raymond Cole. He hadn't said it out loud in years. He'd kept it locked in the same sealed interior room where he stored everything that had gone wrong on that mountain 6 years ago. The decisions made under pressure, the intelligence that turned out to be wrong, the 3 men who didn't come home. Raymond Cole had been one of those men. Quiet, steady, exactly the kind of Marine you wanted beside you when things got bad. The name Cole wasn't unusual. Hayes had told himself that approximately 15 times between midnight and 5 in the morning. He'd been telling himself that since he first saw her name on the assignment board yesterday. He'd been telling himself a lot of things that weren't holding up the way he needed them to. When Amara came on shift at 7, she found a message at the nurse's station. Colonel Hayes was requesting a private meeting. No urgency in the wording. Just a request, formal and restrained, which somehow made it feel more serious than if it had been a demand. She stood at the station for a moment, reading the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and slid it into her pocket. She finished her morning rounds first. She checked on Sergeant Daniels, whose leg wound was healing cleanly. She reviewed overnight charts, updated 2 patient files, and checked in with Eli Turner, who was sitting up at his bed, eating breakfast with more energy than the day before, his shoulders still stiff but his eyes bright. "You seem better," she told him. "I sleep well in hospitals," he said, which surprised her enough that she smiled. "Weird, I know. Most people don't. But I grew up with my grandma who watched the TV loud all night, so the noise and the lights, they actually feel normal to me." "That might be the best thing anyone said to me this week," she told him. He grinned and then turned more serious. "Colonel Hayes asked to see you." "I know. You going?" "After I finish rounds." He nodded, and she could see him wanting to ask something further. She gave him a moment. He took it. "Is everything okay? Between you two, I mean." Yesterday he stopped, reconsidering. He seemed bothered by something. "And I don't mean his arm." Amara looked at the young corporal for a moment. She considered what to say and settled on something true that didn't give away too much. "Sometimes the past shows up where you don't expect it," she said. "That's all I can tell you right now." Eli sat with that. Then he nodded, the way people nod when they don't have a response, but want you to know they heard you. She knocked on Hayes' door at 9:15. "Come in." He was sitting up in the hospital bed, arm elevated, but his posture was different from yesterday. Yesterday, he had been a man holding position, rigid, fortified, the colonel who expected the world to arrange itself according to his command. This morning, he looked like a man who had spent the night rearranging his own assumptions and found the process exhausting. Amara came in and pulled the chair from beside the window closer to the bed. She sat down. She didn't wait for him to set the terms of the conversation. "You wanted to talk," she said. Hayes looked at her directly. His voice, when it came, was measured in a different way than before. Not controlled out of authority, but controlled the way a man speaks when he's afraid of what an uncontrolled version of himself might say. "The tattoo," he said. "On your arm. I need to see it." Amara didn't hesitate. She didn't make him explain or justify. She simply reached across with her right hand, pushed her left sleeve up past the elbow, and turned her forearm toward him. The tattoo was on the inside of her forearm, running about 3 inches along the muscle. It was precise, geometric, built around a specific compass-style design with 4 deliberate points, and at the center, a small mountain peak rendered in clean black lines. Around the base of the mountain, in letters so small they required attention to read, for those who stayed. Hay stared at it. The blood left his face in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. He knew that tattoo. He knew every line of it. He'd watched it being drawn up on a piece of notebook paper in a cramped back room by a Marine named Weston who had an artist's hand and a heavy heart. He'd watched every surviving member of that unit sit in that chair and come away with that mark on their arm. He'd sat in it himself. He looked up at her. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Where did you get that?" "Same place you got yours," she said. "I just got it after." He shook his head slowly, not in denial, but in the particular bewilderment of a man watching a wall he'd built brick by brick turn out to have a door in it he never knew was there. "You weren't in the unit." "No," she said. "My father was." 3 words. They landed in the room like something physical. Hayes went very still. "Raymond Cole," he said. It wasn't a question. It came out of him like something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken to the right person. "Raymond Cole," she confirmed. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something deep and private, something that had been carefully managed for a long time and was now, cautiously, being allowed into the open air. Hayes looked down at his own forearm, where his sleeve covered his matching tattoo. He looked back up at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hayes said something that surprised her. "He talked about you." She blinked. "Just once." "Not often," Hayes said. He wasn't a man who talked much about personal things. But on that operation, the second night, we were pinned down waiting for extraction, timing to clear. He talked. He said he had a daughter who was going to be a nurse. Said she was stubborn in the best possible way. That she could look at a broken thing and already be thinking about how to fix it before she'd even fully taken in what was broken. Amara's jaw tightened. Not with anger. With the particular, concentrated effort of someone keeping themselves together in a moment that is trying very hard to take them apart. "That sounds right," she said, after a moment. Hayes exhaled. He rubbed his jaw with his good hand. "I thought," he stopped. Started again. "I believed I'd failed him. Failed all of them. I made the call that put that unit on that ridge, and then the intelligence turned out to be compromised, and 3 men didn't come back. I've carried that as my failure for 6 years. I know, Amara said. He looked at her sharply. You know. I know because he would have disagreed with you, she said. You came back for the survivors. Command had already written off the extraction window. They'd given the signal to abort and wait for the next operational cycle, which would have been another 36 hours on that ridge with a compromised position. You went against that order. You came back. She paused. 4 men made it home because of that decision. My father wasn't among them, but 4 others were. Hayes was quiet for so long that the ventilation system's hum became almost loud. How do you know that? He asked finally. That detail wasn't in any report. Because one of the 4 men who made it home came to see me, she said. 18 months after my father died. He sat in my mother's living room and told her and me everything that didn't make it into the official record. He said that Hayes came back when he didn't have to, and that it cost him his career trajectory, and he'd probably carry it forever. He said my father knew, in those last hours, that Hayes had made the call to return. She stopped, swallowed once, continued. My father didn't die thinking he'd been abandoned. I need you to know that. Hayes pressed his eyes shut. It was a brief moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then he opened them again and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Something stripped of the armor. Why didn't you tell me who you were? He asked. Because you told me to get someone else, she said. Simply, without accusation. And because I wanted you to see my work first, not my name. Hayes absorbed that. He looked at her for a long time. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't issue a statement or a formal acknowledgement or any of the things a man of his rank and conditioning might reach for in an emotionally complex moment. He simply said, I'm sorry. For this morning? She asked. For all of it. For the assumption. For 6 years of carrying something that should have been investigated more carefully instead of sealed away. For not knowing what I should have known about what happened on that mountain. Amara looked at him. She thought about what to say and chose the thing that was truest. You didn't fail them, she said. That's what I know. And it took me a while to get there. I won't pretend it didn't. But I got there. Across the floor, in the lounge at the end of the hall, Eli Turner had wandered out of his room with his sling properly adjusted and his coffee going cold in his hand. He'd walked past Hayes' room on the way to the water fountain and heard the low murmur of voices from behind a closed door. He hadn't stopped or listened. He wasn't that kind of person, but something about the quality of the silence between the stretches of speaking made him walk more slowly on his way back. He sat in the lounge and stared out the window at the gray November morning and felt that he was on the edge of understanding something that was larger than himself. He thought about what Amara had said the day before, that military environments have long memories, that history gets complicated when not everyone experienced the same version of it. He hadn't fully known what to do with that at the time. It had felt like advice wrapped inside an observation, something that meant more than its surface. He was 23 years old, and he was beginning to understand that the war stories men carried weren't always the ones written in reports. Some of them lived in the silences between sentences, in the way a man's face changed when a particular name came up. And the reason a decorated colonel would react to a nurse with a kind of unease that didn't have anything to do with skill or rank. Eli had grown up watching his grandfather carry things that had no official name. The old man had served in Vietnam and come home and never once talked about it directly. But Eli had learned to read the shape of a burden even when no one acknowledged it was there. He was reading that same shape now in the people around him, and it made him want to be useful in a way that went beyond what his clearance level and his years of service had so far allowed. He drank his cold coffee and watched the morning and waited to understand more. Back in the room, Hayes had made a decision. I want you on my treatment team, he said. I should have said that yesterday. Amara looked at him evenly. I know, she said. There was a pause, and then, to both of their surprises perhaps, a quiet moment that might almost have been humor. Not laughter, exactly, but the warmth that exists in the same neighborhood as laughter. She stood, adjusted her sleeve, and picked up the chart she'd carried in with her. She reviewed the notes on his arm, the imaging results, the projected healing timeline, the follow-up procedures. Range of motion exercises start tomorrow, she said, and you need to actually sleep. Your blood pressure was elevated in the overnight readings. I'll sleep better, he said. He meant it as a medical answer, but they both understood it was something else too. She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and turned back. She looked at the man in the hospital bed, the colonel who had told her to get someone else 14 hours ago, and something that had been quietly wound-tight in her for a long time eased, just slightly. My father was proud to serve under you, she said. He never stopped being. Hayes didn't answer. But he held her gaze, and she saw him receive those words the way a man receives something he has needed for a very long time, without quite knowing the shape of the need. She left the door open when she went. She was almost to the nurse's station when Dr. Garrett met her in the hallway, tablet in hand, expression tightened in a way that immediately told her the morning's quiet was about to end. "We just got a security advisory from the base commander's office," he said. He kept his voice low. "There's a credible threat assessment tied to some of the personnel on the convoy. They're not releasing details yet, but military police are coming to brief us within the hour." Amara looked at him. Her expression didn't change, not in any way that showed alarm or distress. But something in her eyes settled into a focused stillness that a person who knew her well would recognize as readiness. "How many personnel does that affect?" she asked. "Unknown yet," Garrett said. "But we're going to need to review our security protocols and probably adjust visiting access." She nodded. "I'll get the floor organized." Garrett looked at her for a moment. He'd worked alongside her for 8 months, and he'd seen that look on her face exactly once before, during a mass casualty drill when everyone else on the floor had their stress showing and Amara had gone somehow quieter and more precise. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Something like it," she said. She turned toward the nurse's station and began making calls. Within 40 minutes of the advisory reaching the floor, Fort Caldwell Military Medical Center had a different feeling to it. It wasn't panic. The staff was too trained for that, and the military police presence was controlled, arriving in measured numbers rather than flooding in all at once. But the shift was unmistakable. Doors that were usually propped open were pulled shut. The visitor access desk at the main entrance got a second MP assigned to it. Security cameras that normally went monitored but unchecked were now being actively watched from the operations room on the first floor. The vending alcove near the stairwell, which usually had at least one off-duty staff member lounging in it with a bag of chips and a phone, was now empty. Amara had already reorganized the third floor by the time the briefing was called. She'd moved the 2 most vulnerable patients, both with files connected to the convoy, to interior rooms, away from corridor-facing windows. She'd updated the nursing schedule, so there was always at least 2 staff members visible on the floor at any given time. She'd done all of this quietly, without convening a meeting or drawing attention to the changes, so that by the time a military police sergeant named Owen Briggs came upstairs to review floor security, most of the adjustments she'd recommended were already in place. Briggs was a compact, efficient man in his mid-40s with the look of someone who had been professionally skeptical his entire adult life and had never once regretted it. He walked the floor methodically, tablet in hand, checking things off a list that he clearly had memorized well enough not to actually look at. When he reached the nurse's station and found Amara already there with her own written summary of changes, he paused. He looked around, checked his own list, and looked back at her. "Who authorized the room reassignments?" "I did," she said. He looked at her list. Back at his. "These match our priority matrix." "I know," she said. He gave her a measured look, the kind a person gives when they're deciding whether to ask a question or accept the situation. He accepted it. "We're going to need a lockdown protocol in place for the overnight if this advisory escalates. Are your people ready for that?" "We will be by 6 o'clock, she said. He nodded and moved on. But before he turned away fully, she saw him make a small notation on his tablet beside her name. She didn't ask what it said. Dr. Garrett, watching from the nurse's station, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Cole, where exactly did you serve before nursing school?" "I'll get you the overnight lockdown checklist by 5:30, she said, already moving. When Hayes received the security briefing in his room, delivered by Briggs directly, which told Hayes the threat assessment was being taken seriously at a command level, he sat in bed and listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions. The first was about the nature of the threat. The second was about the personnel affected. The third was whether Nurse Cole had been briefed. Briggs confirmed she had. Hayes was quiet for a moment after the sergeant left. Then he eased himself upright and reached for his jacket, still in the bag of personal effects beside the bed, and pulled it on over his immobilized arm with the practiced, one-handed efficiency of a man who had dressed and undressed under worse conditions than this. He was not supposed to be up and walking beyond supervised physical therapy. He walked out of his room anyway. He found Amara at the end of the hall, standing at a small window that overlooked the east parking structure, reviewing something on a clipboard. She heard him coming. She seemed to hear most things before they announced themselves, and turned before he spoke. She looked at him, then at the jacket. "You're supposed to be in bed." "I know," he said. He stopped beside her and turned to look out the same window. "Briggs briefed me." "I know," she said. "You're a target," he said. "Direct, quiet, no softening of it." She turned back to the window. "Possibly," she said. "We don't have full confirmation on the target parameters yet. Amara. It was the first time he'd used her name. She registered it. He saw her register it. And then she turned to look at him fully. "I understand what's happening," she said. "I've been in situations where someone had a reason to want me quiet. Not because of me, because of what I know or what my father knew. This isn't new." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Something complicated, built from guilt and respect, and the particular weight of a man who has spent 20 years sending people into danger and is now standing in a hospital hallway with someone who has been carrying the consequences of the danger he once gave orders into. "I should have looked harder," he said. "After the mission, I should have pushed on a classified file. I should have demanded answers instead of accepting the seal." "You were dealing with your own losses," she said, "and they weren't small. That's not an excuse." "I didn't say it was. I said it was real." She paused. "There's a difference between an excuse and an explanation. You know that. You've been in the field long enough." He held her gaze. "I want to help with security planning. I know this threat better than Briggs does. I know the mission history, the actors, the way they operate." "Then talk to Briggs," she said. "He'll push back on the chain of command angle, but he's smart enough to use what you give him. I also want to know you have someone watching your back specifically." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that carried a complex mixture of things: appreciation and independence, and something that wasn't quite exasperation, but lived close to its border. "I've managed my own back for a long time, Colonel." "I know. I'm not questioning that. I'm saying I want to help." She studied him, decided, "Then help. But do it through proper channels, and don't make it about protection. Make it about intelligence. That's where you're actually useful right now. In that bed, thinking about who would have the operational motive to target people connected to that mission, and why now." He didn't argue. He nodded once, the compact nod of a man who has received an order that makes sense. "I want to talk through what I remember about the mission timeline. In detail. There are things that never made it into any record." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, sleep. You're not useful to anyone running on 2 hours and elevated blood pressure." He almost smiled. "You've been looking at my charts." "It's my job," she said. But there was something dry in the way she said it that was also just slightly warm. Eli Turner appeared at the junction of the hallway. He had clearly been heading somewhere with purpose, but he stopped when he saw both of them standing together at the window. He looked between them. Hayes in his jacket, Amara with her clipboard, the easy and complicated proximity of two people who had reached something through difficulty. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. "No," Hayes said. "Come here. Eli Troaishet." Hayes looked at him with the appraising, not unkind attention of a commanding officer taking proper stock of a junior Marine. "You've been on this floor for going on 2 days," Hayes said. "You've been watching everything." "Not on purpose," Eli said. "Yes, you have. That's not a criticism." Hayes' expression was frank. "What have you noticed?" Eli blinked. He hadn't expected to be asked that, hadn't expected to be included as someone whose observations mattered. He stood a little straighter, despite himself. "The room reassignments," he said. "I noticed those before the MPs showed up. And there was a man this morning, not staff, not patient, not a visitor as far as I could tell, who was in the records corridor on the 2nd floor. I saw him through the stairwell window when I was heading to the lounge. He was moving like he knew where he was going, but didn't want anyone to remember seeing him go there." Amara and Hayes both looked at him with sharpened attention. "Did you report it?" Hayes asked. "I mentioned it to the nurse at the 2nd floor station," Eli said. "She said she'd look into it. I don't know if she did." Hayes looked at Amara. She was already reaching for the radio on her hip. She got through to Briggs in under a minute, relayed Eli's description and timeline, and listened to his response. When she put the radio down, her face was carefully composed in a way that told anyone paying attention that the information had landed somewhere significant. "They're pulling the corridor camera footage," she said. Eli stood very still, processing the fact that what he'd noticed might matter. "Was he? Is that connected to the threat assessment?" "We'll know more within the hour," Amara said. She looked at him steadily. "You did the right thing reporting it. In the future, go directly to security rather than the floor nurse." Eli nodded. He looked at Hayes, who gave him a brief, acknowledging nod that Eli filed away. A nod that said more in one small motion than most people managed in full sentences. The afternoon moved with restrained tension. Briggs' team confirmed a partial match from the corridor footage. The man wasn't positively identified, but his movement pattern through the records area was flagged as deliberate. The specific files he'd been near related to personnel records for convoy patients, which included Hayes and, through the medical attachment logs, a connection to Amara's prior service posting. Amara received this information standing at the nurse's station with Dr. Garrett beside her. Her expression didn't shift. "They're looking at old mission files," she said quietly to Garrett when Briggs stepped away to make call. "Not current personnel records. This is specifically connected to the reconnaissance unit." Garrett looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because the medical attachment logs from that posting are only cross-referenced in personnel files for people who served under a specific command," she said. "That's not a connection a random records breach would produce. Someone knew what they were looking for." Garrett let out a slow breath. "And you're connected to that command?" "Yes." "Does Hayes know?" "He'll know within the hour," she said. "I'll tell him." She told him at 5 o'clock. She sat in the chair beside his bed, the same chair she'd pulled close that morning for the most difficult conversation either of them had managed in recent memory, and laid out what Briggs' team had found and what she believed it meant. Hayes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The timing isn't random. This convoy operation, that we just came back from, it crossed operational geography that overlaps with the old mission territory. Someone noticed. Someone who's been watching for connections," she said. "Someone who has something to lose if the sealed records from that mission get reopened," he said. He looked at her carefully. "Your father found something before he died. Something about the compromise." It was neither quite a question nor quite a statement. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then, he sent a letter. "It reached my mother 8 days after he died. She kept it for 2 years before she could open it." She paused. "I read it when I was 26. I've known for a long time that the leak that compromised that mission wasn't an accident. And I've known that whoever caused it has stayed inside the system." Hayes held her gaze with an intensity that was no longer about command authority, but about something much older. The bone-deep focus of a man who has just realized that a wrong he could not name has been given, finally, a shape. "Then we're going to need to be careful," he said. "Both of us. And we're going to need to be smart." "Yes," she said. Outside the window, the November evening was coming in fast, the last light flattening against the parking structure and the tree line beyond. Inside the hospital, the overtime staff was coming on, the security rotation was tightening, and somewhere in the building the quiet that preceded real danger was settling in. Hayes looked at Amara Cole across the small space between the chair and the bed, and for the first time since she had walked into his trauma bay 2 days ago, the thing between them was not tension or history or the weight of unacknowledged grief. It was something closer to alliance. He had spent 23 years building alliances the official way, through rank, through chain of command, through the structured trust that institutions use as a substitute for the real thing. What was sitting in his hospital room now felt different. It had no structure except the structure of 2 people who had arrived at the same truth from opposite directions and decided, without ceremony or paperwork, to face what came next together. He looked at the window. The parking structure lights had come on against the darkening sky, and the tree line beyond was just a black edge now. "Get some rest when you can," he said. "You too," she said. She paused in the doorway, and he thought she might say something further. She didn't. She simply gave him a brief, direct look that communicated more than a longer farewell would have. Acknowledgement, readiness, trust that was still being built, but was already load-bearing. And then she was gone into the hallway. The night was going to be long. At 11:47, the alarm sounded. Not a drill alarm, not a fire alarm. The security breach alarm. 3 short pulses, then steady, then 3 short pulses again. The one that meant a perimeter had been crossed and the situation was no longer theoretical. Amara was already on the floor when it started. Hayes was already awake. They locked eyes across the hallway, hers steady, his sharp, and the past and the present collapsed into a single, urgent point. Whatever had found them out, there was here now. The alarm didn't give anyone a warning. It simply arrived, 3 short pulses, a breath of silence, then the steady tone that meant the situation had already moved past the point of prevention and into the territory of response. The 3rd floor changed in seconds. Overhead, lighting shifted to the amber emergency mode, casting everything in a color that felt like urgency made visible. Staff who had been charting or restocking or simply moving through the quiet motions of a late-night shift snapped into different versions of themselves. Faster, tighter, their training taking over before their minds fully caught up to what was happening. Amara was already halfway down the hall when the alarm sounded. She'd been doing a final patient check before her scheduled break, and the moment the first pulse hit, she reversed direction without hesitation and moved toward the central nursing station where the emergency protocol board lived. Hayes appeared at his doorway 30 seconds later. He had his jacket on. He was moving like a man whose injury was something he'd decided to set aside rather than something that had healed, and the set of his jaw made it clear that nobody was going to talk him back into that room. Briggs' voice crackled over the security radio at the nurse's station. Confirmed breach at the East Service Corridor, ground level. Multiple individuals, armed, moving in a coordinated pattern toward the interior stairwell. All floors go to lockdown protocol immediately. Amara picked up the floor radio and keyed it. Third floor acknowledges. We are initiating lockdown. Patient relocation to interior ward already completed from earlier today. A brief pause. Then Briggs, good. Keep your floor sealed. Do not open stairwell doors for anyone who doesn't have a confirmed MP escort. Understood, she said, and set the radio down. Hayes was at her shoulder. He wasn't crowding her. He was positioned the way a man positions himself when he's preparing to be useful and waiting to understand where that usefulness fits. What's the layout of that service corridor? He asked. It runs along the east wall of the building from the loading bay all the way to the interior stairwell junction. 3 access points. The MPs will have sealed 2 of them in the first 60 seconds. The third is the loading bay door itself. It's reinforced, but the locking mechanism was flagged for maintenance last week. Hayes absorbed that. That's how they got in. Almost certainly, she said. She was already moving toward the patient rooms, beginning the secondary lockdown sweep, making sure every room door was sealed, every patient accounted for, every staff member in position. Hayes followed. He moved room to room on her left, pulling doors shut and checking locks with his good hand while she verified patient status inside each room. They worked without needing to narrate it to each other. The efficiency between them was the kind that builds either over years or under pressure. They had managed it in 2 days, which said something about both of them. Eli Turner appeared at the junction of the hall, still in his hospital gown, with his sling adjusted crookedly. He looked wide-eyed, but not panicked. The expression of someone running on adrenaline who is fighting the urge to let it make decisions for him. What do I do? He asked. Directed at both of them, but landing somewhere between. Hayes answered without breaking stride. You stay on this floor, away from windows and stairwell doors. You keep your eyes open and you report anything that doesn't look right to Nurse Cole or to me directly. You do not go looking for trouble. Yes, sir. And fix your sling, Hayes added. You're listening to the left. Eli straightened it and positioned himself near the central station where he could see both ends of the corridor. Whatever his role was going to be tonight, he was going to do it properly. Downstairs, the situation was moving fast. Security radio traffic filtered up in pieces. Briggs coordinating with the base MP unit. Position reports from officers on the ground floor. A terse confirmation that at least 3 armed individuals had been positively sighted in the east stairwell. Their movements were professional. Measured intervals between positions. No wasted motion. No noise. These were not opportunistic intruders. They knew the building. Amara heard all of it while she worked. She didn't comment on it, but when she passed Hayes at the doorway of room 7, she said quietly, "They've done reconnaissance. This isn't their first time in this building." No, Hayes said. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had spent enough time planning operations to recognize when someone else had done the same. They have the floor layout. They know which patients they're looking for, which means someone gave it to them. They looked at each other. The access codes, Hayes said. Someone inside. Briggs is already aware that's a possibility, she said. He flagged it this afternoon after Eli's report on the records corridor. Then he'll be managing internal access carefully. Hayes said, good. They completed the sweep of the floor in 11 minutes. Every patient was secured. Every staff member was in position. The stairwell door at the north end of the 3rd floor, the only access point from below, was sealed and had 2 nurses and Hayes himself positioned near it. Amara had taken the south end, near the room that held Sergeant Daniels and one of the other convoy Marines. These are the rooms most likely to be the target, given that their files were directly connected to the old unit. She stood in the corridor with the floor radio in one hand, and her full attention split cleanly between the door at the end of the hall and the sounds coming through the building's walls. Minutes passed. The building was not silent. Alarms don't make things silent. They make things loud in a way that can hide other sounds, but Amara was the kind of person who had learned to listen through noise rather than waiting for it to stop. She heard it before anyone else did. Footsteps on the stairwell landing just outside the south door. Not the heavy, purposeful stride of an MP, something lighter. More careful. She keyed the radio. Briggs, I have movement at south stairwell door, 3rd floor. Not MP pattern. A pause. Then, we have a team 2 floors down on the east side. Can you confirm number? She pressed her ear toward the door. Single individual. Possibly more waiting on the landing. Hold your position. Do not engage. We are redirecting. She held her position. The handle of the south stairwell door moved. Just slightly, a test push, feeling for resistance. The door held. Whoever was on the other side paused, and in that pause Amara could almost feel the calculation happening on the other side of the steel. Assess, adapt, decide. Then the footsteps retreated back down the landing. She exhaled slowly, keyed the radio again. Movement withdrawn from south door. They tested it and pulled back. Copy that, Briggs said. Stay sealed. 12 minutes later, radio traffic shifted. Briggs' voice came through with a different quality to it, still controlled, but with the tight satisfaction of a man whose operation had just resolved in the right direction. All floors, this is Briggs. Intruders have withdrawn from the building through the east loading bay. 2 detained at the perimeter. Remainder of group fled the property. Threat level downgraded. Maintain lockdown pending sweep completion. The floor breathed. Not all at once, and not dramatically. The way relief comes to people who are trained not to celebrate until it's actually over is quiet and internal. But something in the posture of every staff member on that 3rd floor shifted downward by a degree, and Eli, from his position at the central station, let out a breath that he'd probably been holding for 20 minutes. A nurse named Patricia, who had been holding the north stairwell position with Hayes, sat down on the floor against the wall and put her face in her hands for exactly 10 seconds. Then she stood back up, smoothed her scrubs, and went to check on her patients. Nobody commented on it. There was nothing to comment on. They all understood. Hayes walked the perimeter of the floor once before he came back to find Amara. He moved room by room, not announcing himself, just checking, a quiet verification that every door was still closed, every person accounted for, every lock seated properly. It was the kind of thing a commanding officer. It was short, for lines, written in a precise, unhurried hand that belonged to someone who had written under operational conditions before. You kept looking forward. The past isn't finished. The ones who were never named are naming themselves now. Amara read it twice. Her face was very still. They're not done, Hayes said quietly. No, she agreed. But neither are we. She set the paper on the counter carefully, as if it were evidence, which it was. She picked up the radio and called Briggs. Morning came in through the hospital windows the way morning comes after a bad night. Pale and unhurried, indifferent to the fact that the people inside had barely slept. The overnight team handed off to the day shift in the particular silence that follows a crisis that has been survived but not resolved. Military investigators arrived at Fort Caldwell at 7:43 a.m. There were 3 of them, 2 from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division and 1 from a Joint Intelligence Task Force that introduced itself by acronym and declined to elaborate on what the acronym stood for. They set up in a conference room on the 2nd floor, requested coffee that nobody brought them, and began working through the previous night's incident with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this in more complicated circumstances than a hospital alarm. They had a particular way of occupying a space, not filling it the way loud people fill a room, but flattening it, making everything in it feel slightly more formal and slightly more consequential. The staff who passed the conference room door moved a little more carefully past it, the way people move past something they recognize as important without being entirely sure why. Briggs met with them first for 40 minutes, going through the incident timeline and the physical evidence, including the handwritten note. He came out of the room looking like a man who had confirmed what he already suspected and found the confirmation unsatisfying rather than reassuring. Amara was interviewed first of the medical staff at 8:15. She sat across from the lead investigator, a lean, gray-eyed man named Special Agent Donahue, who had the manner of someone who asked questions he already knew the answers to and was simply measuring how honest you'd be about them, and answered everything he asked clearly and without hesitation. When he asked about the note left at the nurse's station, she told him what it said and what she believed it meant. "And what do you believe it means, Miss Cole?" Donahue asked. "Nurse Cole," she said, not unkindly. He nodded, accepting the correction. "Nurse Cole, I believe it means that whoever organized last night's intrusion knows that the records from a classified reconnaissance mission 6 years ago were never fully accounted for. And I believe they're concerned about what a full accounting would reveal." Donahue's pen didn't move. "What would it reveal?" "I think you need to speak with Colonel Hayes about the operational details," she said. "But I can tell you what my father's letter said before he died. He served in that unit. He documented a security leak before the mission collapsed. He believed the leak was internal, not an accident, not enemy intelligence work. Deliberate." Donahue looked at her for a long moment. "Your father was Staff Sergeant Raymond Cole." "Yes." "His personal effects were classified and sealed as part of the mission record." "Yes," she said again, "which is why the letter he sent home never appeared in any official file. It went to my mother, not to the military. He wrote something then, a few words deliberately. And you've had this letter for how long?" 6 years, she said. I've been waiting for the right circumstances to bring it forward. He looked up from his notepad. Would you say last night's events qualify? She met his eyes steadily. I'd say they more than qualify. Hayes' interview followed at 9:30. He walked into the conference room without being escorted. He found a room himself and arrived 3 minutes early, which Donahue noted without commenting on. Hayes sat down, looked at the 3 investigators in turn, and said, I want the sealed mission file reopened. All of it. Whatever was redacted, whatever was classified beyond operational necessity, I want it reviewed by an independent panel. Donahue said, That's a significant request, Colonel. It's the correct one, Hayes said. And I suspect you already know that, or you wouldn't be here this quickly. By mid-morning, the second-floor conference room had become something more than an interview space. Donahue's team had pulled what they could access of the old mission record. Not the classified portions, not yet, but the administrative framing around it, and laid it out on the table alongside the incident report from the previous night. Eli Turner, whose observation window had been extended by the medical team pending a final follow-up, was not in the conference room. He was in the hall outside it, sitting in a chair with his laptop balanced on his knee, doing something that the investigators had not officially asked him to do, but that no one had officially told him to stop doing either. He was cross-referencing personnel logs. It had started because he couldn't sleep. He'd been awake most of the night with the radio traffic still moving through his head and the memory of those footsteps that he hadn't heard but Amara had, sitting somewhere in his chest like something unfinished. He'd started pulling publicly available unit roster data, comparing names and dates, following administrative threads the way he'd seen Amara follow a patient's symptom trail, not looking for anything specific but keeping his eyes open for things that didn't fit. At 11:22, he found something that didn't fit. He knocked on the conference room door and waited. Donahue opened it. I'm Corporal Turner, Eli said. I was in a convoy with Colonel Hayes. I have something I think you need to look at. Donahue studied him for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Eli brought his laptop inside and set it on the conference table. He pulled up what he'd found, a series of administrative transfer records from around the time of the original reconnaissance mission. A specific name appeared twice, in 2 places it shouldn't have been at the same time. A contractor position attached to an intelligence liaison office that had been dissolved shortly after the mission collapsed, and then the same name appearing again 18 months later in a civilian advisory role attached to a completely different command structure. This person, Eli said, pointing at the name on the screen, was listed as being on assignment in Germany during the week of the mission. But this secondary record shows a travel voucher reimbursement for domestic travel during the same week. That's not an administrative error. That's 2 different stories about the same person in the same week. The room was quiet for a moment. The intelligence officer from the Joint Task Force leaned forward. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at Donahue. Donahue looked at Eli. How long did it take you to find this? About 4 hours, Eli said. I wasn't looking for it specifically. I was just following things that didn't add up. Sit down, Corporal, Donahue said. Eli sat. Hayes was brought back into the room 20 minutes later. He looked at the data on the screen, and something in his expression underwent a slow, tectonic shift. The particular look of a man watching an explanation materialize where for years there had only been blame. Franklin Greer, he said, reading the name from the screen. Donahue looked up. You know this name. He was an intelligence liaison attached to our unit during the planning phase of the mission, Hayes said. His voice was controlled, but barely. He was the one who provided the intelligence assessments that guided our positioning. He told us the ridge was clear. He told us the extraction window was confirmed. He stopped. He was the one who briefed us on the operation the night before we went in. The room was very quiet. And after the mission collapsed, Donahue asked. He filed a report attributing the failure to tactical errors made in the field, Hayes said. The words came out flat. His report was the primary document that shaped the official record. His assessment was the foundation of the sealed version of events. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not searching for anything, just giving himself a second of space before he continued. He wrote the history, Hayes said, and then he walked away from it. Donahue's team requested access to the sealed mission file through official channels at noon. The request went up the chain with an urgency flag that Donahue marked himself, which suggested he had the authority to mark such things and the willingness to use it. While they waited, Hayes asked to speak with Amara. She came to the second-floor family room, a small, quiet space with chairs that were slightly more comfortable than the rest of the hospital, and sat across from him in the gray midday light. He looked like a man who had just watched a wall he'd been leaning against for 6 years turn out to be load-bearing for the wrong structure entirely. The guilt, the weight, the 6 years of carrying a version of events that had been constructed specifically to give someone else's mistake a home. All of it was visible on him in a way that his military bearing usually wouldn't have allowed. It wasn't my call that failed them, he said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. It was a man trying on a version of the truth that was new enough to still feel foreign. No, Amara said. It wasn't. The intelligence was deliberately wrong. The positioning was set up to fail. My father figured that out before the mission fully collapsed, she said. That's why he sent the letter. He couldn't reach anyone in the chain of command in time. So he sent it home, the only place he knew it would be safe. Hayes was quiet for a moment. He tried to warn us. He did everything he could in the time he had, she said. Hayes pressed his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, hands that had carried a false version of his own failure for 6 years. Then he looked at her. I owe you an apology that goes beyond what happened in that trauma bay, he said. I owe it to your father's memory. I carried the wrong story about what happened on that mountain, and I never pushed hard enough to find out if the story was true. I accepted the official version because accepting blame was easier than fighting a classified SEAL. Amara looked at him steadily. You couldn't have known it was constructed. I could have questioned it harder. Yes, she said, with a gentleness that had nothing apologetic in it. You could have, but so could a lot of people, and none of them did either. The system was designed to prevent questioning. That's the whole point of falsified record. It's built to hold. He received that, not as absolution. She wasn't offering that, and he wouldn't have wanted her to, but as something more useful, as an accurate accounting of how these things worked, which was different from excusing them. Your father's letter, he said. Donahue's team is going to need it as evidence. I know, she said. I'm prepared for that. It might reopen a lot of things that have been quiet for a long time, he said. It will complicate your position here, and possibly in the wider military medical system, if Greer has connections that are still active. Colonel, she said. He stopped. I've been carrying that letter for 6 years, she said. I didn't become a military trauma nurse because it was the safe choice. I came back into this system because I wanted to be here when it mattered. That time is now. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. Not the compact command nod she'd seen from him before, but something slower. Something that acknowledged rather than directed. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Donahue's access request came back approved. The sealed file on the reconnaissance mission was being transferred for review through a secure channel, with an independent panel convened to begin assessment within 48 hours. When Donahue informed Hayes, he added one additional piece of information. Franklin Greer's name had appeared in recent intelligence as someone connected to a private security contractor operating in the same regional territory as the original mission. The same territory Hayes' most recent convoy had passed through. The timing of the convoy, the attempted hospital intrusion, the targeting of personnel connected to the old unit. It was all, now, forming a shape that was impossible to misread. Greer hadn't just covered his tracks 6 years ago. He'd been protecting something that was still active. The attack on the hospital wasn't revenge or paranoia. It was damage control. Silencing the last people who could connect the original leak to a name. Hayes sat in the family room after Donahue left and thought about the young Marine who had sent a letter home because he couldn't get the warning to the right people in time. He thought about Raymond Cole sitting on a mountainside, knowing what he knew and doing the only thing he could do with it. The smallest, most human act of defiance available to a person who understood they were running out of time. Writing it down, getting it out of the place where it could be erased and into the hands of someone who would keep it. He thought about what it cost to do that. To use your last clear communication, not for goodbye, but for evidence. He thought about what Raymond Cole had raised, sitting 3 floors up in this same building, calm and professional, and carrying her father's truth in a letter she'd read at 26 and never stopped being shaped by. He stayed in that room for a while, with those thoughts, and let them be what they were. Down the hall, Eli had been thanked by Donahue personally, quietly, briefly, in the specific way that intelligence professionals thank people they intend to remember, and had gone back to his room where he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall with the look of someone who has just understood something important about the kind of person they want to be. Amara checked on him at 4 o'clock. You doing all right? She asked. Yeah, he said. He thought for a moment. I found something that mattered today. You did, she said. He nodded slowly. My grandfather used to say that the truth doesn't disappear just because somebody buries it. He said it just waits underground until somebody starts digging for the right reasons. Amara looked at the young corporal and thought about a letter that had waited in a box for 2 years before her mother could open it, and then waited another 4 years inside her own chest until the moment arrived. Your grandfather was right, she said. Outside the window, Afternoon was easing toward evening. Somewhere in a secure facility, a sealed file was being opened for the first time in 6 years. Somewhere in a database, Franklin Greer's name was now attached to a flag that had not been there this morning. And in a military hospital in Fort Caldwell, the people who had spent 2 days surviving the weight of a buried truth were beginning, cautiously and with full awareness of the difficulty ahead, to think about what came next. A recovered communication intercept landed on Donahue's desk at 6:44 p.m. He read it, made 2 phone calls, and walked back to the 3rd floor with an expression that told anyone paying attention that the situation had not resolved itself as cleanly as the morning had suggested. He found Hayes and Amara standing together at the nurse's station, both of them looking like people who had already read the room and were waiting to hear what they already suspected. "There will be another attempt," he said. "The intercept clearly suggests it's imminent. And this time, they won't be testing the doors." Donahue's warning hung in the air of the nurse's station long after he'd walked back down the hall to make his calls. Hayes processed it standing up the way he processed most things that required immediate action. On his feet, already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Digital this time," he said. Amara looked at him. "What?" "The intercept. You said the first attempt tested physical access and found it sealed. They won't repeat a failure the same way." He turned to look at the bank of computers along the station wall. "They'll go for the records electronically. Target the patient files connected to the old unit. If those files get corrupted or erased before the independent panel reviews the sealed mission record, the evidence chain breaks." Amara followed his reasoning immediately. "And without a connected evidence chain, Raymond's letter stands alone. Easier to dismiss as personal correspondence." "Exactly." She was already reaching for the phone to call the hospital's IT security desk when Eli appeared from the direction of his room, laptop in hand, moving with a purpose that had become increasingly natural on him over the past 2 days. "I heard Donahue in the hall," he said. "Another attempt incoming." "Digital," Hayes said. "They'll go for the patient records tied to the mission." Eli set his laptop on the counter. "Then we need to isolate those specific files from the main server access points and flag any external query attempts in real time. If I can work with your IT team, I can set up a monitoring layer that trips and alert the moment anyone tries to pull or modify those records remotely." Hayes and Amara both looked at him. "I did 2 years of network security training before I shipped," Eli said, with the mild tone of someone who's been waiting for the right moment to mention something relevant and is pleased the moment has finally arrived. Hayes made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but occupied the same general territory. "Get on it," he said. Eli got on it. He spent the next hour and 40 minutes at the nurse's station with the hospital's IT security officer, a quiet, methodical man named Gerald who had clearly never worked alongside a uniformed Marine before and kept glancing at Eli's sling with mild concern, building the monitoring layer. It wasn't elegant work. It was the kind of painstaking, unglamorous technical effort that doesn't make for good stories but makes for good outcomes. By 9:30 that evening, every file in the hospital system connected to Hayes' unit, the mission record, or Amara's prior service posting was isolated behind a secondary access flag. At 10:14, the flag tripped. An external query hit the system from an address that routed through 3 separate proxy servers before resolving to a contractor IP that matched a company name in Donahue's existing investigation file. The query attempted to pull 4 specific patient records and 2 administrative personnel files. It pulled nothing. The files had been moved. Gerald stared at his monitor. "They just tried." "I know," Eli said. He was already on the radio to Donahue. The IP trace took 11 minutes. It led back to a server cluster registered to a private security firm, the same firm connected to Franklin Greer that Donahue's team had flagged from the intercept. The physical location associated with the server cluster was 40 minutes from Fort Caldwell. Donahue coordinated with base authorities and local law enforcement simultaneously. The apprehension team moved within the hour. Hayes received the update at 11:45. He was sitting in a family room on the 2nd floor, the same quiet space where he and Amara had talked that afternoon, when Donahue came in and told him it was done. A hospital contractor named Dennis Whitfield, who had provided internal access to the building during the first intrusion attempt, had been taken into custody along with 2 individuals at the server location. Franklin Greer himself had been detained at a private residence 40 miles north of the base, attempting to access a secondary communication system when authorities arrived. Hayes sat with that information for a moment. "He ran," Hayes said. "Not fast enough," Donahue said. After Donahue left, Hayes stayed in the family room. Not because he needed to think. The thinking was done, the actions taken, the outcome arrived. He stayed because the quiet asked something of him that wasn't about strategy or leadership or the next move. It asked him to sit with the fact that it was over. Not cleanly. Not without residue. 6 years of a false story didn't dissolve in a single evening, and Franklin Greer in custody didn't bring 3 Marines back from mountainside. Raymond Cole was still gone. The other 2 men were still gone. Nothing that had happened in the past 4 days changed that, and Hayes had enough honesty in him not to pretend otherwise. But the weight he had carried, the specific, crushing weight of believing he had failed the men under his command, had been named now and given its proper source. It belonged to Greer, and to the system that had let Greer's story go unchallenged. It had never truly belonged to Hayes. And a burden you can name correctly is a fundamentally different thing to carry than one you have been misidentifying for 6 years. Amara found him there at midnight. She came in quietly and sat in the chair across from him without being invited, which by now was simply how things were between them. She looked at him the way she had looked at him through all of it, directly, without softening what she saw, but without hardness either. "Greer's in custody," she said. "Donahue told me. And the file panel starts its review day after tomorrow." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father believed in you. I told you that before, but I want you to hear it again now that the noise is cleared. He believed you were the kind of commander who came back." And he was right. Hayes looked at her. There was something in his expression that was new. Not the stripped-down exhaustion of the past 2 days, not the guilty heaviness she had seen when the truth about the mission began to surface. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked, carefully, like peace making its first cautious appearance. "Thank you," he said, "for carrying it long enough to bring it here." She nodded once. The kind of nod that closes a door gently rather than slamming it. Not because the room behind it doesn't matter, but because what's in it has been properly seen and can now rest. They sat in the quiet family room for a few more minutes, 2 people who had traveled a very long road in a very short time, and let the evening be what it was. The next morning, military officials formally acknowledged Amara Cole's connection to the original reconnaissance unit through her father's service. The acknowledgement came through official channels. A written communication from the base commander's office, reviewed by the Independent Panel Oversight Committee, stating that Staff Sergeant Raymond Cole's role in attempting to document and report the intelligence leak before the mission's collapse was being formally recognized as an act of service. It wasn't a ceremony. Not yet. But it was on record, in the right place in the right hands. Amara read the communication at the nurse's station, standing up, with her coffee going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and went back to her rounds. The week that followed moved differently. It didn't move slowly. A military hospital doesn't slow down on account of resolved crises any more than a river slows down on account of a cleared obstacle. The patient still needed care, the charts still needed updating, the overnight shifts still arrived and handed off to morning teams with the same cups of coffee and the same inventory of small frustrations. But there was a quality to the air on the 3rd floor that hadn't been there before. Something that had been held tight had eased. Hayes' arm was healing ahead of schedule, which his attending physician attributed to proper rest, and which everyone else on the floor privately attributed to the fact that he had finally, reluctantly, stopped fighting the process. He was different in smaller ways that added up to something larger. He asked questions now, where before he had issued statements. When Eli came by his room each morning, which had become an unspoken routine, Hayes listened to whatever the young corporal had been thinking about with an attention that was new. Not performed interest. Actual interest, the kind that comes from a man who has had something rigid in him broken open and discovered, to his own surprise, that the open space is not weakness but capacity. Ili noticeth. He didn't comment on it directly. That wasn't his style. But his visits got longer, and the conversations ranged further, and he started asking Hayes questions about command decisions with the genuine curiosity of someone building toward something. "You're going to be good at this," Hayes told him one morning. Not as praise, exactly. As observation. Eli looked at him. "At what?" "At leading people," Hayes said. "When the time comes." Eli sat with that the way he sat with things that mattered, carefully turning it over. "I hope so," he said. "Hope is where it starts," Hayes said. "Then you do the work." Amara's presence on the floor had shifted too, though she wouldn't have described it that way herself. She was the same person she had always been at work, precise, calm, fully attentive to whoever needed her. But the staff around her saw something different. The private quality she had always carried, the sense of something held carefully in reserve, had relaxed a degree. Not gone. It was part of who she was, but no longer quite so tightly managed. Sergeant Daniels, whose leg wound was nearly healed, told her on the morning before his discharge that she was the best trauma nurse he had worked with in 15 years of service. He said it bluntly, without decoration, the way a man says something he has been meaning to say and has finally decided to stop waiting on. She thanked him the same way, plainly, without deflection. The memorial ceremony was held on a Thursday, 10 days after the convoy's arrival. It took place on the hospital grounds, in a small courtyard the base used for formal occasions too intimate for the main parade ground. The November air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens edges rather than blurring them. There were perhaps 40 people gathered, surviving members of the original reconnaissance unit who had been located and notified. Their families were available, hospital staff, base officials, and investigators whose work had made the occasion possible. Hayes stood at the front in his dress uniform, his arms still in its support brace, but his posture carrying no indication of inconvenience. He had written his remarks himself over 3 evenings and declined when an aide offered to review them. He spoke without notes. He talked about the mission, within the bounds of what had been officially declassified for the ceremony, and about the men who had served in that unit. He talked about the particular character of people who do difficult things in places no one will acknowledge, and how the absence of public recognition doesn't diminish the reality of what they carried or what they gave. He talked about Raymond Cole. He said that Staff Sergeant Cole had demonstrated, in the final hours of his life, exactly the kind of integrity that the Corps asked for in its best moments and too often failed to protect in its institutional ones. That he had seen something wrong, documented it at personal risk, and found a way to get the truth out of the place where it could be buried. He said the evidence that had led to the reopening of the mission record, the exposure of Franklin Greer, and the formal recognition of the unit service had begun with a letter written on a mountainside by a man who knew it needed to exist. When Hayes finished, the courtyard was quiet in the way a space goes quiet when something true has been said in it. Amara stood near the back of the gathered group, in her nursing uniform. She had chosen not to stand at the front, though Hayes had offered. This felt right to her, present but not performing, bearing witness in her own way. When it was over, Hayes found her as the gathering dispersed. "Your father was named correctly today," he said. She looked at the courtyard, the people standing in small clusters, the cold air holding the quiet shape of the ceremony's ending. "He was," she said. A pause. Then Hayes, "I've been in contact with a Veterans Medical Outreach Program. A colleague runs it. Focuses on military families and former service members who fall through the gaps of standard VA coverage. He's been trying to expand it and needs people who understand both the medical side and the operational culture." Amara looked at him. "You're asking if I'm interested. I'm asking if you'd be willing to have a conversation about it." She considered this. Whenever you're ready," he said. "It's being built for the long term." "Then yes," she said. "I'd be willing." They stood in the cold courtyard while the gathering dissolved around them. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had said most of what needed saying and were now simply occupying the same space without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Eli appeared at Hayes' elbow, dressed in his service uniform, arm out of the sling for the first time, commendation ribbon newly pinned. He had received it that morning in a small ceremony Donahue had personally arranged, recognition for initiative during the crisis and the intelligence work that stopped the digital intrusion before it caused harm. He was trying not to look too pleased about it, and failing slightly. "Sir," he said to Hayes. Then, to Amara, "Ma'am, how's the shoulder?" she asked. "Cleared for full duty," he said. He stood a little straighter when he said it, and neither of them made anything of that, which was exactly right. Hayes put out his hand. Eli shook it. The handshake lasted a moment longer than a formal one would have, which meant something, even if no one named it. Hayes was discharged 3 days later. He walked out of Fort Caldwell Military Medical Center on a gray morning with his arm in a final stage support brace, moving the way he had moved in, purposefully, directly, but with something different beneath it. Less like a man clearing a path through the world, and more like a man who had learned to look at what the path had already been through. He stopped once on the way down the main corridor, at the board where the nursing staff posted schedules and announcements and the occasional photograph from a unit event. He stood there a quiet moment without reading any of it, thinking about the past 4 days, and then continued toward the exit. He passed the nurse's station on his way to the exit. Amara was there, reviewing charts, already in the middle of her morning. She looked up. He stopped. There was a moment between them, brief, uncomplicated by anything that still needed saying. What it held was simpler than all that had come before it. Recognition. 2 people who had seen each other clearly through difficulty and history and the weight of truths buried too long, and who were carrying those things differently now. Take care of yourself, Colonel, she said. You too, Nurse Cole, he said. He walked out through the main entrance into the morning air. Amara watched him go for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her charts. Outside, Hayes walked to his vehicle in the pale November light. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about what he was carrying now compared to what he had carried when he came through those hospital doors. He started the engine and drove. Behind him, inside, Amara Cole went back to work, calm and precise and fully present, the way she always was. The past sitting in her differently now. Not lighter, exactly, but truer. And truth, she had always believed, was a better thing to carry than a story built to serve someone else's interests. She had her father's letter in a proper frame now, at home on the shelf where she could see it every morning before she left for her shift. She had looked at it that morning before the drive-in. Not because she needed reminding of what it said, she had every line memorized, but because seeing it framed and solid and permanent in a place of her own choosing felt like a different kind of holding than the careful, private way she had kept it for 6 years. It was no longer something she was protecting. It was something that had done its work and could now simply exist. Not as a wound, as a record, as proof that the truth, written down and kept safe and brought forward at the right moment, could outlast the people who tried to bury it. That was enough. That was truly more than enough. How many times have we dismissed someone, only to realize they were carrying something that could have changed everything? If this story hit home, like, subscribe, and come back. There's always another one worth hearing.